Hi, I'm Camberelle Yolerum, founder of Patriot Podcast and Victory Walking Tours. I'm going to be starting this YouTube channel so that I can talk to you about the Revolutionary War, the people in it on both sides, and the causes that led up to it. The Revolutionary War and 18th century history in general has kind of been a passion of mine since I was a child. And now more than ever, I see a lot of myths and rumors going on. I see these online all the time. For instance, recently there was a post going around claiming that the Revolutionary War was started because England outlawed slavery and the colonists wanted to break away from England so that they can continue to hold slaves. I'm going to discuss why there's absolutely no truth to this story. Number one, the Somerset v. Somerset case, which happened in 1772, long after the ball got rolling toward the American Revolution, only outlawed slavery in England and Wales. The British Empire was by no means interested in outlawing slavery in their colonies. They were profiting too much off of that, off of the slave labor and off of the slave trade as a whole. Even after the American Revolution, England did not end the slave trade for another couple of decades until men like William Wilberforce fought really hard for it. So there's absolutely not one shred of truth. Now, the poster also claimed to have been taught in school that the American Revolution started over boxes of tea. That's a really simplistic and very incorrect viewpoint. The boxes of tea, that's kind of looked at as being, the whole start of the revolution, when in fact the Tea Act and everything that followed was more like the straw that broke the camel's back. This was not the beginning of anything. In order to go back to the beginning of the long train of abuses and usurpations, you have to go to the end of the French and Indian War. So at the end of 1763, you have this world war that England and France and these European powers have fought in the colonies together with various native tribes and their colonists. Basically a territorial war that was really fought not just in the colonies but across Europe as well. So I'm going to cover that and what England did to begin to assert more control and authority and start collecting some revenue. So while I'm talking, I'm going to be putting on makeup. I'm not here to talk about makeup, but hopefully you'll listen and learn a thing or two. So allow me to go ahead and start working. So in 1733, England had passed what's known as the Molasses Act. Basically, it was a tax and forced trade with England to make the colonists pay for British molasses. In New England and Rhode Island especially, you had what's known as the Triangle Trade, and Britain profited heavily from this. The idea is Rhode Island is a place where they make a lot of rum. You need molasses to make rum. Molasses is a byproduct of sugar. So they would make the rum there in Rhode Island. They would ship the rum to West Africa, where captured West African enslaved men and women would be then shipped to the West Indies to work on sugar plantations. Sugar plantations in the West Indies were extremely horrific in their work conditions. That's why you have these cruel masters threatening to ship their slaves if they don't behave to the West Indies, to a sugar plantation. They always threaten, you're going to be sold to the West Indies, which is an evil thing to do. And the idea is sugar plantations are a horrible place to work. And slaves were quite literally worked to death on those plantations. So you have Rhode Island selling rum to West Africa in exchange for enslaved men and women who are going to the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations, and the West Indies is in turn sending the molasses back to Rhode Island. So that's what they call the Triangle Trade. Now, England profited a lot off of the triangle trade, so they really didn't want it to go anywhere. Now, Rhode Islanders did find that they could get cheaper prices on molasses by trading with the Dutch or others, especially where they could trade for items instead of money and pay a lower tax. So England didn't really like that, but they weren't really enforcing the Molasses Act up to that point. It had been in effect for decades, and they weren't really doing anything about it. However, on April 5th, 1764, they enacted the Sugar Act, which in effect, really the tax was not any higher, but they would have more resources. They would increase the resources to actually enforce this law. So they would send the Navy, the British Navy, to Rhode Island, and that would basically start for the next 10 years or so before the Revolution even started, an all-out war in the waters of Rhode Island. And I'm going to cover that more as I go on. But basically you had the British Navy occupying the shores of Rhode Island. They were harassing shippers, even shippers who were minding their own business and doing exactly what they were supposed to do. You had them firing upon ships. So really you had the people of Rhode Island beginning to defend themselves, which of course was seen as sort of an act of aggression against the King's Navy. And you had pretty much a war there. There were customs officers, or customs enforcers rather, who would sail around Rhode Island basically harassing ships where they were just minding their own business and doing their job like they were supposed to. To compare that, you could imagine if today, if every time you left your house to go to work, the cops were out here pulling you over, harassing you, shooting at your car. That's exactly what was happening. To take it a step further, they were impressing people's boats, they were impressing people. So imagine you're out riding, the cops pull you over, they say, I want to use your car because I don't like my cruiser, and you're going to be my partner today. So they basically force you to use your car. They may force you to work for them, and you don't have a choice. And you say, hey man, I'm just trying to get to work. And they take over your car and they take over you, and you don't really have a choice. That was going on quite a bit around New England and Rhode Island. And that's going to come into play a lot more later as I go on. So people were really not happy about the Sugar Act. But even though there were protests and, there was basically a fight going on in Rhode Island, the colonists, as a rule, didn't really question Britain's right to tax them in this way, not overtly. And the thing is, Britain's debt was so much, and not all the colonists' fault. They were never going to recoup all of their financial losses through a tax on molasses or a tax on paper or anything else other than the taxes that they exacted. These taxes were to raise revenue, which really was not something that they had done before in this manner. They already had 1,000,001 trade laws and customs laws. In the colonies here, they're not allowed to grow certain type of sheep. They're not allowed to make certain types of dishware or other products that they can sell or export. You're not allowed, technically you're really not allowed to smuggle from other places, because you're only allowed to buy from approved British merchants. But there were, of course, people doing this. So Britain decides they're going to increase their ability to catch these smugglers and the underhanded dealings and raise revenue. So on March 22nd, 1765, Parliament, under Prime Minister Lord George Grenville, passes what's known as the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act basically taxes every single piece of paper. And just like today, back then, you needed legal documents for everything. To get married, to sell a house, to buy a house, to trade property, playing cards, any kind of paper that you might use, whether for legal purposes or frivolity, is taxed. You have to pay a tax, and that tax all goes directly to England. Now, the main objection that the colonists and many of the Englishmen as well, including Isaac Barré, very much had to this act is that it was raised and voted on in Parliament. You hear that phrase, no taxation without representation. You may not fully understand what it means. Now, in Parliament, then, just like today, members of Parliament represent their constituents. They are voted upon, and they represent their locality that they are voted from. We had assemblies, representatives, and legislative bodies here in the colonies, and we had rights as Englishmen. However, the people who could have voted on these measures, who could have said, yeah, okay, we'll pay this tax. Yeah, okay, we see where this tax is a good thing. Those people were not consulted. They were not allowed to vote on it. The members of Parliament who did not represent us were the only ones who voted on it. We didn't get a say. So that was the main objection. We didn't get a say, and it was direct revenue raising for Great Britain. It wasn't anything for the colonies. Now, there were people who felt that America should pay for their defense. And the thing is, you have the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. You have very different attitudes between the British and the Americans. General James Wolfe had nothing good to say about the colonists. He said that the colonists were dirty, that they were dogs, that they died where they stood, that they were just such cowards. But George Washington, who was a colonel in the Virginia militia at the time, said almost the exact same thing about the British troops. He said that his militia behaved bravely, but that the regulars would flee and that they were full of cowardice. So you clearly had a divide, and you clearly had both sides complaining about the other one. Now, the other thing is, Britain wanted to leave a standing army in the colonies. Even in England, a standing army during peacetime had been illegal since 1689 and had to be renewed every year. If they wanted to keep a standing army during peacetime, they had to renew that every year by repassing the Mutiny Act. And that was not voted on in the colonies. That was not requested by the colonies. The colonies were used to, since Jamestown, since 1607, defending themselves with militia. So basically, every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 60 would train in the militia and be ready. There were arms stored up which belonged to the people. You had to have a certain amount of powder and shot in your home. You had to be prepared, and you would meet and elect the officers of your militia. That was how they defended themselves, and that was what they were used to doing. But now Britain wants to leave a standing army of regulars in the colonies. And as Isaac Barré said, basically they were trying to spy out the liberty of the Americans. That's really what they were trying to do, or how many Americans felt. And so they're trying to pay for these massive costs of having an army everywhere, having over 10,000 troops in the colonies. So they're going to have to pay for that somehow, and things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act are ways to do that. Now, along with the Stamp Act, on March 24th, 1765, they passed the Quartering Act, which basically impressed upon colonists to have no choice but to allow soldiers, the king's soldiers, to be billeted in their homes. They didn't get any say in this. They didn't have any choice. And that, of course, really ruffled some feathers. That's one reason why, after independence was won, we have a rule against that. You cannot force quartering of soldiers in people's homes. So, of course, it takes a little while for word to reach the colonies of these acts. But when word does reach the colonies, they're furious. So, one of the things they're going to do is threaten and intimidate the stamp agents. The Stamp Act is going to take effect November 1st of that year, 1765. And people are protesting it heavily before it ever even gets there. On May 29th, 1765, Virginia lawyer Patrick Henry, on his own 36th birthday, he stands in the House of Burgesses. He's newly elected. He's newly elected to the House of Burgesses, and he doesn't really have a lot of say-so, a lot of pull yet, but he goes up and he gives the speech of his lifetime, and he yells at them, you know, that Charles I had his Cromwell, and Caesar had his Brutus, and then he says, and George III, and the men start yelling, treason, treason, and he says, may profit from their example. And then he yells, if this be treason, make the most of it. So he introduces what he calls his Stamp Act resolves, which are basically measures to protest officially to England, to boycott certain goods, and to say, we're not going to take this lying down. We're not going to take this Stamp Act. Now, when Isaac Barre argued in Parliament for the rights of the Americans, he called them the Sons of Liberty. So, in August of 1765, a group of men got together in Boston and called themselves the Sons of Liberty. This featured a lot of prominent Bostonians, such as Paul Revere, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and others. And basically, they were trying to protest the Stamp Act and get it repealed. I have to say, as patriotic as I am, some of the actions of the Sons of Liberty were truly terroristic. They tarred and feathered the stamp agents, ransacked warehouses, and did a lot of things that were actually pretty bad in order to make these stamp agents resign or swear an oath that they weren't going to try to collect the stamp. And a lot of them did resign, which is a good thing. But like I said, many of their actions were genuinely terroristic. However, it did eventually lead to the repeal of the Stamp Act on March 18th, 1766. The same day, they passed the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act, or American Colonies Act, basically said, yes, we do have the right to do whatever we want. We can tax you any way we want, and Parliament can say anything they want about you. So now they're saying, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but now we're going to pass a law that we do have the power to enact such things as the Stamp Act or other revenue-raising taxes without your consent. Obviously, this was actually a pretty new idea. But England was looking to pretty much subjugate all of their colonies and make as much revenue from the colonies as possible. And not just what we think of as the 13 colonies that would become the states. England had a lot more colonies than that around the world at that point. In the Americas, in the West Indies, and basically they decided we can tax you without your consent. So then, a year later, on June 29th, 1767, they passed what were known as the Townshend Acts. named for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. And the Townshend Acts basically placed taxes on way more than paper, on lead, glass, tea, porcelain, many other products that the colonists would need and were required to order through their merchants in England. You know, you couldn't just buy something. Your merchant or shop or whatever had to order it from merchants in England. So, you know, you're having to pay customs and duties and that kind of thing. Well, now you're having to pay extra taxes on any kind of item included in the Townshend Act. So paper, paint, lead, glass, tea, porcelain, and many other items. And of course, the Americans were not happy about this. There was even more protest. There were talks of boycotts. There were, threatening and harassing the collectors and agents and customs officers. So tensions were really, by this point, this is 1767, tensions are getting very high. But what you have to understand is, no matter what you may have heard in history class or since then, no one's talking about breaking free from the British. No one's thinking, oh, we need to leave British rule. That's not what anybody's thinking at this point. They're thinking, how can we work this out with Mother England? How can we make this work? Benjamin Franklin, who is a great diplomat, he is in London in the House of Commons arguing for the colonists. William Pitt is speaking out for the liberty of the colonists. Edmund Burke is speaking out. So you have prominent British political figures saying, hey, we need to not do this. We need to not keep threatening the Americans. And in fact, William Pitt even says, the Americans have not always behaved prudently, but they've been wronged by us. So we should reach out and be conciliatory and see if we can work this out. Which, of course, Britain's not interested in doing. So on June 10th, 1768, you have this incident where a ship belonging to John Hancock was captured by the British Navy. And basically they charged him with smuggling French Madeira, and they later dropped the charges, but they kept his boat for their own use. And really, to put that into perspective, imagine the cops pull you over. They think you're dealing drugs or selling drugs in your car. They search your car, they impound it, and they decide ultimately you weren't selling any type of drugs, you weren't doing anything wrong, but they're still going to keep your car because they'd like to use it. So that's really what happened, and that really stoked tensions. People were furious. And John Hancock was, he was a well-known merchant. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty. People really didn't like them taking his ship. So move forward to 1770. You have this incident known as the Boston Massacre. So a private Hugh White was standing on sentry duty outside the Boston Customs House when a peruke maker's apprentice, if you don't know what a peruke is, it's really an archaic word for a wig. So, hairdressers, peruke makers are very necessary at the time. So the peruke maker's apprentice comes up to this sergeant in the British regulars and accuses him of not paying his bill to the peruke, which the sergeant said, yes, I did pay it. And to be honest, it wasn't really the apprentice's place to come out here and start accusing him of not paying his bill out on the street anyway. So it turns into a huge argument. Things get really bad. And then nearby colonists start really pressing in on the British regulars. And really, just a small little fight in no time turns into a massive, tense situation. And you've got the British preparing for whatever might happen. You've got people like Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller, who would later become the Continental Artillery General. saying, hey, if you kill these colonists, you're going to be executed. There's nothing you can do here. You try to de-escalate this situation. The British soldiers tried, but you've got just a handful of soldiers. Yes, they're armed and the crowd isn't, but it's a huge crowd. And they're not just throwing snowballs like you might have heard. This is the power of propaganda, because 5 people were killed and it's still called a massacre to this day. And a lot of people think, oh, they just had snowballs and they were getting killed. No, they had rocks, they had cudgels, they had clubs. They were out here prepared to draw blood. They were angry, justifiably, about the presence of the soldiers, but how this incident was handled was not necessarily the best. So, at some point, one of the men in the crowd hits one of the soldiers with a stick or a cudgel, and the man's weapon discharges by accident into the crowd. At that point, things become violent. It's a confused mess. Others fire. It's really bad. 3 die instantly. Another dies later that day, and the other dies a couple of days later. And his dying declaration, basically he gave eyewitness to the event. His dying declaration became a landmark usage of dying declarations in court. Now, these men were defended by John Adams, who was very patriotic, who opposed all of these acts and all of these things that England was doing in America. But he believed that in this case, these soldiers are operating in self-defense. They're doing what they can to defend themselves, which I agree with. And, you know, basically they were mostly let off. You had a couple of them branded, you know, for manslaughter. But I don't see where they had a choice. However, like I said, the power of propaganda. Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, made this engraving of these poor unarmed civilians being brutally killed by these armed British soldiers. And this propaganda really helped to stoke the flames. People were so furious. These soldiers who just killed unarmed, poor, innocent civilians. And that's really not what happened. But no matter what happened, it was still a symptom of the fact that England had all of these troops here policing the people when they really shouldn't have been. So that kind of helped to fan the flames. Now, on June 9th, 1772, you have this incident which would basically just become known as the Gaspee incident. So, up there in Rhode Island, I'll go back to that for a minute. In Rhode Island, like I said, you have pretty much an all-out naval war on the coast of Rhode Island. And Lieutenant William Duddingston was especially vehement and committed to his duties in stopping smugglers. But the thing is, he wasn't just stopping suspected smugglers. He was pretty much harassing and even firing upon anybody he just didn't like, or even just boarding ships for the heck of it and searching ships that had passed customs, and he knew they had passed customs. Now, he was riding around in HMS Gaspee, which was actually a commandeered craft belonging to a local merchant shipper, John Brown. And on June 9th, he ordered a packet sloop called Hannah, who had just passed through customs, to stop and prepare to be boarded. The captain of the Hannah decided instead to lead the Gaspee on a chase. Now, the captain knew of a nearby point, off of Namquet Point. He knew of a nearby sandbar. Everyone who had been sailing there most of their lives knew of this sandbar. They knew to avoid it. They knew it was dangerous, and many ships had run aground there. So he led Duddingston and the Gaspee on a chase toward that sandbar The Hannah avoided the sandbar, but the Gaspee ran straight into it, ran aground, and was stuck. Well, John Brown was still pretty ticked off about Duddingston taking his ship to begin with. And so he and some others met to discuss what they would do. And they got together a little makeshift naval operation headed by Abraham Whipple, who, interesting point, would later become the first Commodore of the Continental Navy. Now, they went out in 8 longboats, which were manned, gunned, and the oars were muffled. You would wrap linen or, material around the oars so that they would be quiet. They rowed out to the Gaspee. This is the night of the 10th. They rowed out to the Gaspee. They basically performed this de facto arrest on the crew. In the process of this arrest, someone shot Lieutenant Duddingston, which he survived, but they had shot, the king's man. And once they had everyone off the ship, they set fire to it, and the powder magazine blew up, so the ship just completely was obliterated. Well, John Brown, I guess, was happy that the king's men were no longer using his ship to sail around threatening people. But the king was extremely angry about this, and in fact, the king issued a proclamation offering £500 to anyone who could give them information leading to the arrest of any of the members of the crew, and £1,000 for information leading to the arrest of whomever had been this self-appointed sheriff who had led the group. And the idea was, if those men were turned in, they were going to go to England for trial, which is wrong for a lot of reasons. They would not face a jury of their peers. They would not have the chance to face charges in their jurisdiction. This was against their rights as Englishmen. So even though everybody knew who had done it, there was no secret, all the colonists knew exactly who did it, they would not give him up, even for the money. They didn't care about the money, but they were not about to give up Abraham Whipple, John Brown, and the others who had partaken in this incident. But of course, this incident is just another in the Rhode Island versus England naval war. Now, there's a very interesting book on the Gaspee incident written by Stephen Park and published by Journal of the American Revolution. I definitely recommend that book. It's really good. So then the next thing that year you have is a group of men getting together in Boston at Faneuil Hall, which would become an important meeting place in the struggle for liberty, to form a committee of correspondence. Now, they had somewhat committees of correspondence in the past to get together to discuss certain incidents or start, fighting against legislation, things they didn't like. They would have these committees of correspondence in the past. But this one was set up basically to be as long as these troubles last. So they got together and made a network, basically a network of men who could communicate. They would have writers who would go and share information, especially emergency information, alarms. They could keep in touch and keep, discussing and sharing these things and sharing ideas. But they would, most importantly, raise alarms or information of something happening, a new development, something that they needed the men gathered for. And other colonies would follow in this. There would be committees of correspondence throughout the colonies after that point. Now, on May 10th, 1773, you have what's known as the Tea Act. So the Tea Act, like I said, people see like the Tea Act as being, oh, this is where it all started. No, this is more or less the straw that broke the camel's back. So the Tea Act, it actually, in effect, decreased the taxes, the actual taxes that the colonists would pay on the tea. However, it was an underhanded plan to basically sell the tea at a cheaper price, then trade those taxes off as something else in kind of an underhanded manner, and to raise revenue to save the East India Company. The East India Company sold tea. They were losing money due to tea being smuggled by the colonists or purchased from other places, such as the Dutch or whatever. So basically, England had an interest in saving the East India Company. Now, the colonists saw this as yet another underhanded revenue-raising tax, and they didn't like it. So they were going to fight against this. So through a long series of events, which I'm actually going to cover in the next episode, because there's more to cover in Boston than what I can cover in just this episode. But in Boston, you have this incident where you have the tea in the harbor, and every school child at least knows this story. You have the men going on board the ships dressed in these Native American costumes and dumping 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor on December 16th, 1773. So obviously England was very angry about that. Excuse me while I put this on. So England's very angry about that. And they're going to ensure that Boston pays for the tea that was destroyed. And how they're going to do that is through measures known as the Coercive Acts, or by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, because they were intolerable. Now, those were passed starting March through September. There were 5 acts, and they were passed at each different time. The first was the Boston Port Act, which would close the Boston port to all shipping in and out, basically shutting down the port and starving the people of Boston until they could pay for the actions of those who had destroyed the tea. So you're punishing an entire city for the actions of some people. This would become very, very, very difficult. People would go hungry. Businesses would close. Things would be very bad. Now, when news of the Boston Port Act reached Virginia, the Virginia Burgesses knew this was going to be bad. So they called for, on June 1st, 1774, the day that the Boston Port Act would take place, they called for a day of prayer, fasting, and humiliation in solidarity with the people of Boston. They weren't trying to say that they agreed with the Tea Party or not. They were just standing with the people of Boston. Virginia Governor John Murray, Lord Dunmore, saw this as an act of rebellion because it was a little too much like agreeing with what happened in Boston. So he completely just abolished the House of Burgesses, the colony's representatives. So to put that in perspective, it would be as if the president today didn't like something that Congress had done, so they just completely abolished Congress. This was a clear act of tyranny. So the men who were Burgesses, men like George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Peyton Randolph, all these men got together at the Raleigh Tavern on August 1st, 1774, and formed what's known as the First Virginia Convention. Now, the head of the convention was Peyton Randolph, Williamsburg, Virginia resident, who had been the Speaker of the House of Burgesses. They voted on the creation of Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress, and they planned to boycott trade with England, which they did. They put that in effect. And basically they said, we're not going to take this sitting down. They're not going to put up with what England is doing to them. So I'm going to leave off there with the First Virginia Convention. Next episode, I'll get more into what's going on in Boston, because there's a lot going on throughout the colonies, but there's a lot going on in Boston that's going to lead to Lexington and Concord and that shot heard around the world. So I'm going to get more into that next episode, but I'm going to leave you with that. The First Virginia Convention. So they've been completely abolished. They decided to meet in defiance of the governor and make plans that are really going to start propelling the colonies toward open rebellion. These men risked their lives and their homes and their families in order to stand up for their rights.